Hello, I'm Matt Donnelly, and this is your Thursday Night Football game preview featuring the Philadelphia Eagles and the Houston Texans. Now, look, I get it. It does not look spectacular on paper, but games, they are not played on paper. And Thursday Night Football, some strange things occur on Thursday nights. I'll tell you what right now. Now, the Eagles, they are taking on the 1-5-1 Houston Texans. Like I said, on paper, this game is completely one-sided, favoring the Eagles. But could the Eagles be walking into a trap game here ahead of their NFC East showdown with the Washington Commanders here next week? Probably not, but I had to find a way to try and hype this video somehow, some way. But before we dive into the tail of the tape, head over to fantasypoints.com today. Find that subscription that fits your needs and use promo code 22Vipers10. That will get you 10% off today. Now here we go, starting with Jalen Hurts and the Philadelphia Eagles. Here we are. Fans are somehow, some way not being able to appreciate something great that they have right in front of them. Now, I'm not just talking about Eagles fans. I'm talking about those older type of fans here that don't believe that quarterbacks should be able to run the ball. And that maybe perhaps they believe that Jalen Hurts runs the ball too much. Look, on passes that have traveled 25 yards or farther down the field, Hurts is completing 61.5% of them, and that has led to 4 touchdowns, a 145 passer rating, and 0 interceptions. So when he wants to let it rip, he's letting it rip, and it ain't getting picked. Only Josh Allen has been more impressive with the deep ball this season, and guess what? He runs the ball, and nobody complains about that. Calm down, people. Just appreciate the greatness in which we are seeing. And how could you not come away being impressed when you stack Hurts' numbers up against the rest of his peers? 2,102 total yards in 7 games. He sits 13th in passing yards with 1,729 to go along with those 303 rushing yards. His passer rating this season is 105.1, and he has totaled 16 touchdowns to only a pair of interceptions. Last week against the Steelers, Hurts heard all that noise. He heard everyone talking, and he went out there and threw for 285 yards and 5 passing touchdowns. And a week 8 high there of a 140.6 passer rating. If you were looking at true passer rating, that Hurts, he sits 5th in the National Football League behind Josh Allen, Patrick Mahomes, Geno Smith, and don't you laugh because Geno Smith is playing balls out right now, and Lamar Jackson. As far as pass defenses are concerned, the Texans, you know what? They've actually been pretty good, allowing just 11.09 fantasy points per game to opposing signal callers so far this season. Houston is allowing 217 passing yards per contest, but over the last 3 games, that number's actually dwindled down to about 185 yards per game. Jerry Hughes, he's an oldie, but he's a goodie as he leads this Texan team with sacks, with 5 of them so far this season. After Jerry Hughes and Rasheem Green there's a considerable drop-off amongst pass rushers there for the Texans, and they just, quite frankly, they can't get after the quarterback. Now, speaking of the quarterbacks, let's talk about the other quarterback here for the Texans, about Davis Mills here. For one, hey, I have to admit, I was expecting bigger and better things out of Mills so far this season. And I saw a little bit of promise last year, but promise has not equated to production here in 2022. Now, looking at the rookie class from a year ago there, and looking at the last 2 weeks, Mills sits only behind Justin Fields as far as PFF is concerned when it comes to offensive grades. Then again, that probably doesn't speak too highly of this class here from a year ago. Against Tennessee last week, Davis, look, he was 17 of 29 for 152 yards, a touchdown, a pick, and he was sacked on 3 occasions. If Mills could complete just 1 pass there on 7 targets, and that ended up being for negative yardage against Christian Fulton last week, what are his chances? Really, what are his chances against Darius Slay and James Bradbury this week? Philadelphia, as a unit, they rank 4th in passing yards allowed per game at 183.4 per contest this season, which happens to be, and they've been allowing the 2nd fewest fantasy points per game this season to opposing quarterbacks at 9.83. Now, things were already tough enough for opposing quarterbacks when facing Philadelphia. Philadelphia, they went out there and they got themselves an all-pro pass rusher there in Robert Quinn from the Chicago Bears. Prior to Quinn's arrival in Philadelphia, there was no brotherly love being shown for opposing quarterbacks there. As the Eagles, they had at least 4 players with at least 3 sacks. Those players, Hassan Reddick, Javon Hargrave, Brendan Graham, and Fletcher Cox, they have propelled the Eagles to the 5th most sacks this season with 23. Now, turning our attention to the running back position, starting with the Eagles once again. How about we talk about Miles Sanders? Haters going to hate, but Miles Sanders, he's going to currently sit eighth in the NFL in rushing yards with 563 in 7 games, while averaging 4.9 yards per carry. That's more than Derrick Henry. That's more than Najee Harris. That's more than a lot of RB1s that we're talking about all season long. Last week against the Steelers, after a slow start, Sanders would end up finishing with 78 rushing yards on just 9 carries and a touchdown. That works out to, if my math is correct, 8.7 yards per carry, per touch, however you want to look at it. This man, he needs more touches. Eagles, can we please get Miles Sanders the ball a little bit more? Look for Sanders to continue to have fantasy success, as the Eagles have been putting teams away early and often and grinding it out in the fourth quarter of games so far this year. Sanders sits 5th in fourth quarter opportunities this season, meaning he's going to get the ball plenty late and down the stretch. One reason why the Texans have been stout against the pass is because teams have been running on them all over, running at will, running the ball whenever they dang well want to. Currently, the Texans, they sit last in yards per game surrendered this season, allowing 186 yards on the ground per game. That's 30 more yards per game than the next closest team to them. Houston is the only team to allow backs to produce over 1,000 yards this season on the ground, and they've also given up an additional 252 yards to backs in the passing game to go along with 11 touchdowns. Sanders' chances of getting to second and third level in this contest are actually pretty high, so expect good tackle performances coming from Jonathan Williams and Jalen Petrie there, who rank first and third on the Texans in tackles. The other running back I want to talk about, how the Texans running back here, one of the best rookie backs so far this season, Daemon Pierce out of Florida. From a strictly fantasy points per game view, Pierce has a slight advantage over Miles Sanders, averaging 15.4 per game to Sanders' 14.5 fantasy points per contest this season. But both, they sit inside the top 20 as far as fantasy is concerned. Last week against the Titans, Pierce had his streak of 4 consecutive games of more than 100 scrimmage yards snapped, as he was only able to produce 51 yards on 19 touches. However, he did manage to salvage his day, turning one of his 3 receptions into a touchdown. Philadelphia this season is allowing the 13th most fantasy points per game to backs, having allowed an average of 23.25 per contest there, after allowing 7 touchdowns and 826 total yards. And most of those can be courtesy of the 38 receptions in which they've yielded. Expect Pierce to meet up with TJ Edwards there and Kazir White on more than a few occasions this week, as the Eagles linebackers have 68 and 48 total tackles respectively this season. Now, speaking of respect, how about we put a little RESPCT on these Eagles pass catchers, starting with A.J. Brown. Now, look, Josh Allen, he didn't become quite that MVP candidate he is today prior to the arrival of Stephon Diggs. We are seeing the same thing take place in Philadelphia right now with Jalen Hurts since the arrival of A.J. Brown. Since arriving in Philadelphia, Brown has 659 receiving yards on 39 receptions, and he has found the end zone on 5 separate occasions. Meanwhile, back in the Smoky Mountains, back in Tennessee, Titans receivers have combined for 658 total receiving yards, and Robert Woods is the only wide receiver who has a touchdown in Tennessee so far this season. Now, Brown, he also leads his Eagles with a 31.5% target share, which happens to be the 5th highest in the NFL, and he's accounted for 43% of the Eagles' air yards to date. Last week alone, A.J. Brown had 3 touchdowns, and that was before the first half of the game even ended. Imagine what kind of production this Eagles team is capable of doing if the games were a little bit closer heading into the second half. Brown would finish his day with 156 yards on 6 receptions after seeing double-digit targets yet again. Definitely something the NFL needs to randomly drug test for each and every week. Now, DeVonta Smith, he doesn't get the same kind of accolades in which A.J. Brown carries with him week in and week out. Look, Brown, he had those 156 yards last week, and it's easy to forget DeVonta Smith. I mean, after all, he did only have 23 receiving yards. A deeper look into Smith's days, and it shows that he, in fact, had only 23 receiving yards, but he did have 8 targets, which was still good enough for a 27% target share, thus opening a buy low window, if you will, once again, for fantasy managers looking to acquire the secondary receiver there in Philadelphia. Now, on Brown's first touchdown, Smith, he looked like he was the primary target there, as Brown's job was to clear things out for Smith. And it just happened to be that Brown got the ball. Now, it's not because Smith's not getting opportunities. Those opportunities are going to be there for Smith each and every single week. Now, on the season, Smith has been effective. He is actually seeing a 35.8% target share, which happens to be the 15th highest in the NFL, which also is an improvement on the 23.7% target share he had a season ago. Smith has also provided the Eagles a 420 air yards to date there, and his ADOT is actually lower this season than it was last season, coming in at 7.2 when compared to 2021, when that ADOT was sitting at 14.9. Now, we talked about how vulnerable this Texans run defense has been, which is probably one of the reasons why that their pass defense has looked as good as it has so far. Houston has been the 5th toughest team against opposing receivers this season, allowing just 27.25 fantasy points per game. But we know that the Eagles, they're not afraid to run it, but they like to throw the ball around a little bit too. Now, speaking of throwing the ball around, how about we talk about the Houston Texans pass catchers there, starting with Brandin Cooks. Now, the NFL trade deadline, it has come and gone, and Cooks, he is still a Texan. Most likely had something to do with that contract situation there. Probably had something to do with the Texans wanting second-round pick, but there's certainly no lack of interest there when it came to Cooks and teams looking to acquire his services. On the season, Cooks, he has caught 32 of 53 targets. Those 53 targets, that ranks 34th in the NFL. He's also turned that into 354 yards and just a single touchdown, which he hauled in against the Chargers a few weeks back. Now, Cooks, he has been held under 90 yards receiving in each and every contest so far this season, despite being targeted 5 times per game each and every week. Cook has seen a 24% target share so far this season and is responsible for 492 of the Texans' air yards this season, which works out to 28.46%. Houston needs to find a way to get the ball into their playmakers' hands. And Cook's hands, they're pretty good when he gets an opportunity. This week, things get a little bit complicated when he squares up with Darius Slay. Post-trade deadline, Cooks, he took to Twitter with kind of an ominous tweet. Don't take a man's kindness for granted. Covered for the lies for too long. Those days are done. Cross the line with playing with my career. What that means, I don't know, but Texans brass, they probably have a pretty good idea. Now, the other pass catcher here for the Texans of relevancy is Nico Collins, who has missed the last week there with that groin injury. Nico Collins is sitting at 305 yards this season without a touchdown, which is amongst the tops in the league in that category there of players who are producing yardage but not scoring touchdowns. Alvin Kamara was kind of the poster boy for that up until last week's 3-touchdown performance against the Las Vegas Raiders. Collins, he is still working his way back in the lineup with that groin injury there, but they need to get him back in the lineup more now than ever before, especially after seeing who the next receiver in line is behind Cooks, which happened to be Philip Dorsett, who caught 1 of 5 passes there for just 6 yards. Now, how bad has this pass-catching group been for the Texans? If you look at team stats and all these other numbers, I mean, sure, the Titans are worse at 658 that we talked about. The Bears are at 784. The Ravens at 790. The Texans, they are next there with 853. To put this all into perspective and wrap it in a bow, Tyreek Hill has 961 yards to date. Yeah, that's not good. Now, Philadelphia, this defense, it gets after you. Philadelphia has recorded 10 interceptions this season. They've only given up 7 touchdown passes, and only 5 of them have gone to wide receivers. Now, game scripts may force the Texans to throw against the Eagles earlier than they would perhaps like to do, which could help fantasy managers debating whether or not they should be starting any Texans pass catchers this week. The Eagles are allowing the 11th fewest fantasy points per game to receivers this season at 30.65. Now, if those receivers don't do nothing for you, how about some tight ends, which, once again, the Eagles have the advantage in there with Dallas Goedert. Look for the Texans safeties to make themselves familiar with Dallas Goedert this week, as the Eagles pass catcher sits 3rd amongst the position there with 421 yards this season. That's 60.1 per game. And as much as we respect the hustle in fantasy, we need ourselves some tutties. With 32 receptions to date, Goedert has only managed to find the end zone on 1 occasion, which is why he sits behind Taysom Hill and, yes, Tyler Conklin in PPR leagues. Now, Houston, they currently occupy the 11th best mark when it comes to defending opposing tight ends this season, having allowed just 315 yards, 2 touchdowns against, while surrendering just over 10 fantasy points per game. Now, if we're going to talk about the Eagles tight end, I guess we have to talk about the tight ends for the Texans. It's not pretty, but hey, we're going to talk about it anyway. How this pass-catching group struggled in Houston this season? O.J. Howard and Brevin Jordan were 2nd and 3rd last week in receiving yards with 24 and 19. And I'm not even going to add respectively to the end of that sentence. Meanwhile, the Eagles, they sit in the middle of the pack, allowing just 11.27 fantasy points per game, which is the 15th fewest, while tight ends have produced 329 yards on 34 receptions and 2 scores in 7 games. Now, if you're looking to score more, I already told you where to go. Head to fantasypoints.com. Use that promo code 22Vipers10. That'll save you 10% off that subscription of your choice. Get in, get on, and get going. We'll see you next week.